Republican operative and judge Kenneth Starr died this week, and let's talk a little bit about Judge Starr. This is a man who had as much impact on, I think, our politics over the last 50 years or so as perhaps any other in some ways. What's your take on the life of Ken Starr?
He was, his death was met with very warm remembrances by a lot of groups in the conservative movement over the course of the last week. Actually, one thing that stood out to me in that Peter Baker piece in the New York Times, and obviously Peter Baker it's very, very familiar with Ken Starr, having covered the Clinton, the entire Clinton saga of the 90s that Ken Starr was front and center for. Peter Baker wrote, "He became a Rorschach test for the post-Cold War generation, a hero to his admirers for taking on, in their view, an indecent president who had despoiled the Oval Office, and a villain to his detractors who saw him as a sex-obsessed Inspector Javert driven by partisanship. His investigation tested the boundaries of the Constitution when it prompted the first impeachment of a president in 130 years and scarred both Mr. Clinton's legacy and his own." Now, I went and looked at what the New York Times wrote in 1998 before the Starr report came out, and it's really, really interesting to see not just the arc of Ken Starr's career, but just the arc of his investigations into the Clinton administration. There was actually optimism when Ken Starr was chosen to investigate Whitewater all the way back in 1994, because he had a great reputation in D.C. on a sort of bipartisan basis that simply does not exist in Washington, D.C. anymore. There are not a lot of Democratic-aligned lawyers and Republican-aligned lawyers who will vouch for each other and who would want people to be overseeing investigations into them. And so the Clintons had an attorney, their White House counsel, Abner Mikva, who had assured them that Ken Starr is basically the best choice that they could have had. Mikva thought of Starr, when Mikva thought of Starr, words like, quote, ethical, fair, and decent came to mind, and that's according to the Times, all the way back in 1998. Now, the Clintons, of course, were not initially so pleased with the work of Ken Starr.
Right, and I'll say something nice about him. First, more recently in his life, he was doing some very useful and righteous death penalty work. Like he was working for people who were either wrongfully convicted or who deserved some sort of compassion, and I think that flowed from the best of the kind of compassionate Christian kind of movement that you could have. So, sideline that. What happened to him? Like, what happened to the fair-minded, bipartisanly respected judge who went in to examine Whitewater, which was Whitewater, good Lord, the most boring thing ever.
Really boring.
It's this accusation that the Clintons basically profited somehow unfairly from some type of deals where they had some insider access. There ended up being no evidence for that. And so they go several years, they find every piece of paperwork. There had been some missing documents that elevated it to the level of, let's bring in a special prosecutor because they're hiding evidence or something. They found the documents. They're in some box somewhere. They looked at everything. They're like, you know what? Actually, this is clean. Like, this is
clean-ish.
It's complicated. There's no crime here, and so they're close to shutting the books on the investigation.
He was investigating the death of Vince Foster as well.
Investigating the death of Vince Foster, which they concluded was what it seemed like it was, that it was a suicide.
Ken Starr did, right?
Right. And so they're shutting the books on this. And then they keep the books open. And, there's, I forget, was it on FX, has a good drama on this recently.
Yeah, it's the Ryan Murphy drama. It's actually very good.
And Brett Kavanaugh is a main character. They always call him Kavanaugh.
Right.
Just to make sure that the viewer knows that this is Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh was one of the investigators that worked under Starr. And like, Kavanaugh, what do we got? And so then they find the sex stuff. And they start pressuring
through the
women.
Paula Jones. I mean, that's
Right,
the interesting thing is it really, Paula Jones is the avenue
Which had nothing to do with Whitewater.
Monica Lewinsky, right? But what they had heard basically is that there was some funny business going on, and then Linda Tripp gets involved, and they go into the Lewinsky stuff. But it did start with learning of Paula Jones, and no, it didn't have anything to do with Whitewater.
So it's so kind of wildly outside his mandate. What do you think it was that? And it did seem like he was like genuinely offended that this hippie, like this figure of the counterculture, was out there playing jazz and engaging in all this infidelity, and maybe assault. And they include a rape allegation, a credible rape allegation, in like the footnotes of the Starr report. But then it goes from there, and it just snowballs. And I remember when the Starr report came out, I was in college. It was a bestseller.
God, you're old.
People, yeah. They were, I wasn't following it very closely. It wasn't something that people in college really cared about until the Starr report came out.
I was going to say, it seems like it was right for the college demographic.
It was the raciest thing you could possibly imagine a government agency or a government prosecutor producing, like a softcore narrative that came out in 300 pages and was selling in the college bookstore. I'm like, what is going on here?
Ken Starr, though, expected that to be redacted, right? Like some of the gritty stuff from the gritty is an understatement.
Who did he expect was going to redact it?
The House, I think, released an unredacted version, and it wasn't expected. I don't know what the redactions would have looked like, but I think that was part of the
whole thing would.
Yeah, it's like the Trump affidavit. And so Ken Starr, this is interesting. By the way, people always reference him. Representing Big Tobacco. He represented Jeffrey Epstein. He left Baylor University over allegations that athletes were given basically special treatment in sexual assault investigations. As you mentioned, Ryan, he had been doing good death penalty work, and I think respectable death penalty work, very much so. But he, looking back on Lewinsky, he published a memoir in 2018, and so this is like 20 years later.
Did you read that one?
I didn't read it. No, I did meet Ken Starr on I think one or two occasions, and he was a perfectly pleasant person. But he said, "quote, I deeply regret that I took on the Lewinsky phase of the investigation, but at the same time, as I still see it 20 years later, there was no practical alternative to my doing so." He said later on CBS that he regretted the whole thing. They asked him what parts of it he regretted. He said, "I regretted the whole thing, but it had to be done." Now, Monica Lewinsky responded.
What?
So Monica Lewinsky responded this week, and she put out a tweet that said, "As I'm sure many can understand, my thoughts about Ken Starr bring up complicated feelings, but of more importance is that I imagine it's a painful loss for those who love him." Response from Monica Lewinsky was totally able to reinvent herself and I would say she actually produced a series of I think that Ken Starr was in this position. You mentioned earlier that he seemed genuinely offended by Bill Clinton's presence in the Oval Office. I think he knew the country, though, would be genuinely offended to know that the president was covering up these relationships, was using public resources to engage in the relationships, and was not being honest about them. And so I think that put him in an extremely difficult position. And that's what he sounds like he's regretting. He regrets being in that position, but doesn't know what else could have been done.
He could have closed the investigation, and then he could do what all honorable people in Washington D.C. just go leak it. You don't like what it is. Like, go tell David Brock about Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky, and if the press can like suss it out, Michael Isikoff was doing lots of reporting on that. There's
Peter Baker,
great story where Isikoff walks into the Pentagon to find Linda Tripp, goes to her desk, and then she comes out and talks with him, and that's the way that we've done sex scandals going back to Andrew Jackson, and before that. That's normal. This thing where you throw people in prison, people forget that. There were Clinton friends who he wanted to testify, who refused to testify, refused to participate in this. whose lives he utterly and completely destroyed, some of whom he actually put in prison, or for contempt of his subpoena. So that, which is something we should remember now that Steve Bannon is a political prisoner. Like Ken Starr had political prisoners. He had people who were refusing subpoenas that he locked away. That's not how you have to handle things that you're offended by. You're offended by something. It's a free country. Go tell us that you're offended by it. To turn it into this criminal and impeachment matter, I thought was just way overboard, and also was really a lot of people have, I think, effectively made the argument is a place that kind of broke the system as well.
That's what I was going to ask you about, because it's easy to look back on it in 2022 when things feel so broken. It's another thing when, especially in the conservative movement of the 1990s, there was this idea that the government had careened out of control and needed to be, especially the federal government and Congress in Washington, D.C. It was sort of the swamp, right? It was this earlier version of the swamp narrative that things had to be brought into accountability and into check. And that's where I'm curious from your perspective on how this led to, if you think it did, it sounds like you think it did, how this led to where we are. What's the sort of, does this open the floodgates is maybe a good way to ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sharpened a lot of partisan knives. Like and I think partisanship is good when it's muscled behind kind of ideological energy.
Genuine ideological energy.
If it represents a political movement,
right,
then good. Get the partisan knives out and fight for your political movement. If it's just two factions knifing each other over power to do nothing but screw over their enemies, then it's like, then what are we doing? And so you had this entire generation that then kind of felt like it was in actual war, with the other side, because personal bankruptcy and prison were becoming, things that people in the political culture knew had happened to either to them or to people close to them, and that really shaped, I think, the thinking of a lot of people as it then. Now, everything is kind of disrupted. And the pattern is disrupted because September 11th, 2001 attacks come just 3 years after this is all happening, and so it kind of put a lid on things for a while, and then, but I think it then reemerged in this visceral way.
I would keep plugging the FX thing because I actually thought it was pretty well done. But what it highlights is how many people, as you say, when you mentioned Kavanaugh, were around for the Whitewater investigation, for the special counsel, and for the Clintons. I mean, the Clintons are still huge players in our politics themselves, and so we can spend a lot of time talking about Ken Starr, and Bill Clinton is a. It's also very interesting because Ken Starr has gotten a lot of flack for representing, rightfully gotten a lot of flack for representing Jeffrey Epstein. And we grilled Alan Dershowitz the other week over sort of similar things. He's rightfully gotten caught up in that. He also defended Donald Trump in impeachment, against impeachment, and in ways where he said, impeachment is, basically he was saying it's a can of worms, and it's a deeply unpleasant process for the country and not just the person implicated, and should be done only with the utmost seriousness. Now, it is, to your point, thinking of all of the people who went through that in the 90s, who are now even in bigger positions of power, who have moved through the halls of power in different ways. In D.C., you can see how bitterly this would have divided people in ways that there is no recovery from, basically.
Right, and what an ironic way for him to end his career, with, like you said, with the Baylor cover-up of sexual assault. Like, you can't make this stuff up. That this is how that portion of his career ended. So I'm going to go back and read his memoir now. It sounds fascinating.
I bet it's very, very interesting. And the Monica, it's been very interesting to see Monica Lewinsky's perspective played out in very high-profile ways in recent years as well, with this totally fresh set of eyes from America in 2022 on what happened. I bet Ken Starr's memoir, though, is probably pretty interesting too, because it sounds like, clearly, it doesn't sound like, clearly he wasn't happy with the position that he was put in. What he chose to do with that, Ryan has some thoughts on.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.